Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting guest for you tonight, an author. Laine Halpern Zisman is her name. She's an adjunct professor at the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria. She is the founder and project lead on Family Building Canada and a certified fertility support practitioner with Birthmark in Toronto. Her research traverses the intersections of Two-Spirit, LGBTQ plus, equity, culture, and reproductive care. And you've written a book on a guide to making Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus families. Wow. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about your book.
Yeah. So the book is kind of a culmination of the work I've been doing for the past 5 years with Birthmark and longer independently. And it really is intended to be a practical guide for folks who are trying to navigate their family building journeys. Oftentimes, we don't know where to start or who to talk to or what resources are available for queer and trans people who are looking to build their families. So the book really came out of that, and it focuses both on the individual journey and on the kind of systemic barriers that exist and the supports that might help you navigate that.
Conceivable is for birthing parents, non-gestational parents, families seeking a surrogate or donor, and those who do not yet know what they need. With illustrations, worksheets, and activities to help you think about the intimate questions of communication, relationship building, and community, this guide will prepare you for the knowledge you need to navigate advocacy, rights, and regulations.
That's
Wow.
right.
So
Yeah.
why did you write this?
Yeah, great question. So I started writing it because of me and my partner's own journey. When we first started thinking about building a family, there was really nothing available in the Canadian context. There are some books that are wonderful that are written in the US context, but of course, especially looking at healthcare, it's quite different here in Canada. And looking at the histories of reproductive health in Canada, and even just like the processes or the way to go about doing it, there really wasn't a how-to guide. So I became certified as a fertility support practitioner and full spectrum doula. So I help people at all stages of their family building journeys, pregnancy and postpartum.
Sorry, hold it. Full spectrum what?
Doula.
What's that?
Oh, great question. So, a doula is someone that provides support during transitional periods. Most often, we see the word doula used for labor and delivery and postpartum, offering support and education. So, doulas are people who are kind of there to help someone who's going through the process of pregnancy and delivery and postpartum to help them learn about different comfort measures that are available, different preferences, and also things like how to advocate for yourself. So, what is a regulation or what is an option that might be available to you that you didn't know? When can you say no to a doctor? What kinds of preferences might be available to you that you don't know about? And then also offering kind of physical supports like during the postpartum period, like helping you with a baby and teaching you the basics of lactation or the basics of care. So it's emotional support, it's physical support, it's advocacy, education, it's all those things. Doulas are trained to work in a lot of different kinds of support. So mine focuses on family building, but there are doulas for abortion support. There are death doulas who help you to prepare yourself if you're dying. Yeah, there are lots of kinds of doulas.
What a interesting area for you to get involved in. Now, you're an adjunct professor. What's your area of teaching and research?
Yeah, great question. So actually, I did my PhD in theater and performance studies and the collaborative programs in sexual diversity studies and women and gender studies. That really led me to do some consulting in sexual diversity studies after I finished my dissertation in defense. So I worked independently as a sexual diversity consultant, working with folks to improve inclusion in their organizations, to think about equity and access. And then I shifted when I became a fertility support practitioner and really shifted to focus on health. So my postdoctoral fellowship, which I just finished last month, was in the School of Public Health and Social Policy. And that's where I really started focusing on LGBTQ health and reproductive care. And now I'm an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Victoria, and I teach at the University of Toronto in sexual diversity studies.
How do you work in Victoria and Toronto?
Yeah, so and as an adjunct assistant professor, I do research primarily. I don't teach there, so I'm located in Toronto.
Oh,
And
okay.
I work remotely at the
I was
University of
thinking that,
Victoria.
you know, between classes, between Victoria and Toronto might be a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I do go there occasionally for my work, but I am based in Toronto and I teach at the University of Toronto.
Okay, so I want to ask a lot more questions about the book and how you know have this manual and suggestions and stuff like that. But just in case any of our listeners don't know, can you please explain? You know, gay is something that I think lots of people understand, but LGBTQ is something that has sort of become more known. Maybe you could explain that. And then what's the two spirit and plus that have been added to
Yeah.
this term that we are referring to now?
Yeah, so the acronym at the beginning of the title is really trying to be as inclusive as possible, but of course it does exclude people, and that's kind of why that plus sign is there at the end. It's a much longer acronym, right? So 2S refers to Two Spirit, and that is an umbrella term for Indigenous folks. Two Spirit is a settler term for the many different genders and ways that Indigenous people might identify historically and currently. There are Two Spirit is a typically the way we understand it, but this is certainly an oversimplification. Refers to people who don't sit neatly within a Western settler idea of male and female or man and woman, but inhabit two genders or more genders. Historically, they were people who were leaders in their community. LGBTQ is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And the plus sign is for a whole bunch of other identities that exist across the spectrum of genders and sexualities. So really the book is intended for folks who don't fit neatly into a heterosexual relationship structure. That doesn't necessarily mean anything about how they're building their families, right? So we could have folks who are bisexual who might appear to be what we would call straight passing. So they might have someone with sperm and with eggs readily available in their relationship. We might have someone who's a cisgender man and a cisgender woman, and that one of them is bisexual. That would still be a queer family building experience that would still fit within the structure of the book.
What's straight passing?
Great question. So straight passing is just how other people see you, right? So it would be if other people might assume that you are straight. And we can see the double-edged sword of that. It's like both a positive thing of like maybe you don't experience discrimination, but at the same time you experience invisibility, right? Like you're not seen for who you really are. So there is a little bit of a double-edged sword there. But straight passing just is how people see you. So it's when people assume that you're straight, you pass as straight.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that word before. And I hope you don't think me naive or whatever, but why is there both a G and a Q? I thought they were the same thing.
Yeah, great question. So queer and gay are just different ways that people identify. Queer can be an umbrella term for a lot of different things. And gay typically refers to, usually, not always, but typically refers to men who have sex with men and identify under that term.
So
But queer
is broader than gay?
I mean, it's an individual term, right? So everyone feels differently about it. For some people, it's just like a term that feels more right for them. For other people, it's just a broader term that has more flexibility. It can mean a lot of different things.
Okay. So I guess the most important question, and I think the answer is obvious, but let me ask it. Do two SLGBTQ plus people want to have families?
Yeah. Some of them do and some of them don't, right? So I think that just like anyone else in the world. Some people are looking to build families and see that in their future, and some people don't. Some people love the idea of having a lot of cats or dogs as their family, and some people want to have babies, and some people want to adopt, and some people want to foster. And your sexuality or your gender doesn't determine that, and it doesn't necessarily shape that. It might shape how you do it, right? Like if you're planning to build a family and you want to have a baby and you want to create a human life, that might be a little different depending on what you have available to you.
This is a fascinating conversation tonight. And I think something that a lot of us need to be aware of. And congratulate you for writing this book. And thank you for coming on to talk to us about it tonight. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. We're talking about Conceivable, a guide to making 2S LGBTQ plus families. The first book of its kind in Canada. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Laine Halpern Zisman with us tonight. She's come out with a book called Conceivable, a guide to making 2S LGBTQ plus families. A first book of its kind in Canada. And I think this is going to be interesting for a lot of us to explore. I got to tell you, Laine, I was in Florida last week in the middle of Trump country and having dinner with some people. And we were chatting for about an hour and a bit. And I was asking one of the females at the table about her daughter and found out that her daughter was 30 years old and she'd been married for 10 years. So I said, well, so, obviously your partner's not, or your husband's not the father of your child. And she said, well, no. And my partner is a female. And then she went on to tell me, and again, I was a little bit surprised because I was in the middle of Trump country, very conservative area. And she went on to tell me that she came out as lesbian when she was in her early 20s, and in her mid 20s decided that she was never going to marry a man, but she was very interested in being a mother. And so this would have been 30 years ago. She had IVF treatment to have a girl, and she showed me pictures. The girl was wonderful. She's getting married next year, and she told me great stories about her and the relationship that her daughter has with her current partner. Is really quite interesting. Is it tough? Is it challenging? Today, let alone 30 years ago, for a lesbian couple to have a baby?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for some people it is, and for some people it isn't. For some people, it is the first time they've really encountered homophobia or exclusion. And for other people, it can be a kind of like seamless, beautiful experience. So it's really hard to say what someone's going to experience. We do know that there is homophobia and transphobia that still exists in Canada, in the United States, certainly. So we know that these things exist, and that's why it's so important that we talk about it. And it's so important that we learn and educate others, and that we learn about access and what options are available. Really often I tell people that, like, when they say, like, what's this experience like? I say to them, like, expect the unexpected. We have to go into this thinking that whatever you think is going to be the next step, there might be a hurdle that comes up, that comes in the way. So we have to really anticipate that there might be challenges. And part of the work that I hope the book does is helps people to think about what kind of strategies can they use to navigate those surprises.
What are some of the choices people have in creating families?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I usually start these conversations by saying that we need three things to make a human life. We need a uterus, we need eggs, and we need sperm. And beyond that truth, there is so many different ways to build a family, right? We need those three things, and they can come from so many different places. So part of the decision is learning about the options that are available, and then thinking about what you as an individual might want if you're planning to build your family. So three kind of big decisions are where you're getting egg and sperm from if you don't have them within your family unit or within the parenting unit. So that could be from a known donor, from an acquaintance, from a friend. It could be from a bank. Even within a bank, there are options. So you can have a fully anonymous donor, which are a little bit less common now. You can have what's called an open ID donor, which is when the donor conceived person, when they turn 18, they can find out the last known contact information of the donor. And you can have a known donor where like you know that information about that person. So that's one big decision, is who's going to be the donor if you need a donor. The second big decision is the method. Like, how do you want to go about doing this? And for that, there's, again, a long list of options. So one option, as you mentioned, is IVF. And that's where eggs are stimulated to grow within a person. They're retrieved from them, and then they're fertilized with sperm in a laboratory and grown to embryos. Those embryos can be frozen or they can be used right away. And then there's also IUI, which is when sperm is put directly into the uterus of someone who's trying to carry a baby. And then there's at-home insemination. And that can be done through penile-vaginal intercourse, or it could be done through insemination.
Sorry, the second one was what?
IUI.
What's that?
Intrauterine insemination. So that's instead of inserting sperm into the cervix, you would be inserting it into the uterus. That's done in a fertility clinic. Oh, and then I guess the third big decision is, if you're planning to go a medicalized route, is choosing a clinic.
Now, one can go to a sperm bank and get sperm, I understand. Can someone go get eggs?
Yep, there's also egg banks, yeah.
And what are they, I presume, frozen or something?
Yeah. So you can either get eggs are a little bit more complicated than sperm. They can be. So you can either get frozen eggs from a bank, or you could go through the process of finding a donor and getting those eggs retrieved freshly for your specific purpose.
So you can get sperm, you can get eggs.
And then you would also need, if you can't carry the pregnancy yourself, you would also need to look into getting a surrogate. So that would be for a couple or parents who don't have a uterus to carry the sperm, to carry the embryo.
And so if I was in Toronto and wanted sperm or eggs or a surrogate, how would I go about doing that?
Oh, it is a big process, and there are so many ways to do it. And again, like, I think this is a really long journey for a lot of people because there are so many options. So part of that is figuring out what you want, what as a parent, as intended parents, and then seeing what's like available to you and what's realistic. So there are surrogate agencies that can help you to find a surrogate. A lot of people will find surrogates on their own independently. In that case, I would always say to speak to a lawyer. There's a wonderful lawyer in the book who I have a conversation with in the book named Sarah Cohen. And you can speak with a lawyer about the process of finding a surrogate. If you're using a known donor, you can speak with a lawyer as well. The parentage in Ontario is actually very well defined of like what makes a parent. It's based on intention. So if you have clear intentions of being a donor at the time of birth, the donor doesn't have any parental rights, like they are a donor. You choose whose names go on the birth certificate. But you should always speak with a lawyer to make sure that all of your T's are crossed and I's are dotted, to make sure that everything is going in the way that you intend it to. But yeah, there's a lot of options available. So you can look online at catalogs, you can speak with people you know, and you can talk to agencies and fertility clinics.
How does, what are the rights of a surrogate?
Yeah, so surrogates are not parents. They are carrying the embryo and the fetus, but they are not parents. I don't think there has ever been a case in Canada where a surrogate has tried to get parentage of a baby. There's two kinds of surrogacy, and this is talked about in the book. There's traditional surrogacy, which is less common, and there's gestational surrogacy. So a gestational surrogate is someone who's carrying an embryo that they have no biological ties to. So it wasn't their eggs and it wasn't their sperm. Traditional surrogacy is when the surrogate uses their own eggs.
And which is more prevalent today?
gestational surrogacy, where there's no biological ties, just because that way it's much more simple legally. And although, again, like I don't think there has been any legal grounds for a surrogate trying to claim parentage.
And what if the egg donor or the sperm donor wanted parentage rights or access or knowledge after the fact? Is that possible?
Yeah, so a donor is not a parent, right? Like that is very clear. A donor is signing off their rights. They're not a parent in any way. If someone wanted to be a parent, there are family structures where folks become co-parents, and that is decided beforehand in advance. It's not decided after the fact. But yeah, a co-parent is different than a donor. A donor is not a parent.
And if a gay couple or a lesbian couple or a straight couple go to a clinic in Toronto, are they treated any differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really, truly believe with all of my heart that the intentions of doctors and nurses and staff are so good. They really, I think, are trying so hard to be equitable and to have access and inclusivity for all of their patients. At the same time, we know that in Canada, there isn't enough education on LGBTQ experience, on their needs, on gender affirming care. So we know that there isn't enough of that formal education. So sometimes there is a little bit of a learning curve, and that can come at the expense of LGBTQ people's access or inclusivity. So I would say their intentions are definitely positive, but the experience of the patient is not always positive.
So if you had a gay or lesbian couple come to you and ask for some advice, or maybe it's written in your book, for what they should do as they're thinking about this, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest recommendation is to learn as much as you can about the options that are available to you, to figure out before you even get in the door anywhere, to think about what preferences and priorities are important to you, right? Sometimes when things are medicalized, we feel a little bit isolated or detached from them. And I really encourage people to bring themselves back into the story. So what is it that you want? What is it that you need? What are your priorities? And once we go through that process of identifying what your preferences are, then the next step is to think about, okay, well, if I can't meet those preferences can't be met, then what am I going to do next, right? How can we strategize to address change? So that might look like if you choose a donor and for some reason that donor doesn't work out. So then what's your plan? What are your preferences to do next? And that might be like pressing pause or speaking with a doctor about other options or going to another clinic or choosing another donor, but really thinking through those steps so that you feel prepared and that you're able to advocate for what you want.
I interviewed two young ladies that were the twin daughters of a lesbian couple from a Eastern Ontario small town. And they said that they were probably the first, or their mothers were their first lesbians that anyone in the town had ever met. What are attitudes like in Canada, both in small towns and big towns, toward gay children of gay couples, lesbian couples, and do you give any advice to people as to where they should live as they raise their children, or no, just go and live wherever you want?
That's a great question. I think geography definitely changes our experience. And one of the ways geography does that is our access to care. Certainly like in Toronto, in a city center, we see a lot more fertility clinics. We see a lot more LGBTQ resources and programming. And in smaller towns, some small towns are very inclusive and some of them are less so. Some provinces have funding for fertility treatments and some provinces do not, or are just in the process of introducing that. Some provinces have a lot of clinics and some have none. So every place is different. I think a huge part of it is people speaking with community members, going on social media and finding other people who live there, finding out about queer and trans inclusivity before you choose where to live, so that you can go in with your expectations really set of, okay, I'm going in somewhere, I've chosen this location because of my work or because of my family, but I know these programs exist, or I know these programs don't exist, right? So we're really setting expectations so that we can choose where fits best for our family.
This sounds like a really interesting book. Where can people get it if they're interested?
Yeah, so you can buy it online on Fernwood's website. You can get it from any major bookstore online, and a lot of books are now carrying it in bookstores are carrying it in their stores now as well. So yeah, you can buy it online.
Remind us the title.
It's called Conceivable, A Guide to Making 2S LGBTQ plus Family.
We're going to take a break and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Laine Halpern Zisman. She's got a book called Conceivable, A Guide to Making Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus Family. And it sounds like an interesting book that's sort of a handbook on how to go about creating families, what to do, some of the issues involved, etc. Laine, I apologize, with the U.S. election this week, maybe I could ask you a few questions, since obviously it's relevant to your book. You mentioned transphobia in our last segment. Transphobia seems to be a big issue in the United States right now, and phobia against gays, queers, lesbians doesn't seem to be as big anymore, but probably still prevalent. But transphobia really does seem to have taken off as part of a political talking point and issue in the United States. Do you agree, and why?
I mean, it is a huge talking point, and I think it is quite scary to be removing the rights and access to care for trans people, both in the US and in Canada. We see it happening in Alberta as well. I think people have a right to choose what their pronouns are. I don't think that should even be a discussion. I think people have a right to choose their names and what they want to be called. I think people have a right to the medical care that helps in their survival. We know that gender affirming care is essential for trans folk to feel in their bodies, to feel safe, to live full lives. And we know that is essential. So I think it's really scary what we're seeing in the US and in Canada. And I think we really need to protect trans people, trans kids, trans adults, and ensure that they get the medical care that they need. Yeah, it's terrifying.
So, there was even big hullabaloo about drag shows. Why?
Yeah, that one I really don't get. Honestly, as I mentioned, my PhD is in theater. And I mean, this is performance, right? When we look at drag shows, this is typically like joyful, wonderful performances of folks dressing in beautiful, spectacular clothing. And to hone in on that and just say that is hurting someone, I think is really a shame. Drag story time is something that has become kind of a hot topic, saying that it's hurting children. I think that is really—
What's drag story time?
So a lot of libraries now or bookshops host drag story time, where they have a drag queen come and read storybooks to kids. And it is a beautiful way to have kids meet different people, to have a performer come in and do a show for kids. Drag is a performance, right? It's very different than being transgender. Being transgender is someone's gender identity. A drag performance is someone putting on a costume and putting on a show. To say that this kind of a show could be harmful because of what someone is wearing, I think is honestly silly. And I think that we should really be encouraging our children to learn about differences, to learn about gender expression. So how do we express ourselves through our clothing? How do we express ourselves through our makeup? All of that is just it's just a way to show our children how to be inclusive, how to be equitable. And I think honing in on drag shows is really missing the point, because it's just a fun, wonderful performance that has a very strong history in LGBTQ culture as a form of performance, that sometimes can have a political message and sometimes can just be a joyful performance.
One of the other big issues that, I've been surprised that's come up so often. I guess I didn't realize that there may have been as many people as some people would suggest there are, but it's trans people or biological males that have transitioned to being female, competing in female sports, and then people saying this is an unfair advantage. And where's this issue all come from?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we can look at a lot of these different issues and see like the polarization that is increasing in our society. And it's not always evidence-based. Like, we know that folks who are on estrogen actually don't have an increased ability in sports. And I think that we can see that. So we know that to be true. They are actually suppressing their testosterone. So I think that we can look at all kinds of things, and we have to kind of ask where the line is. Are we going to say that like we only want this kind of body or that kind of body? We've created, as a society, we have created this idea of there is a female and there is a male, and this is what's normal, and this is what's normal, and that's all. The reality is that even biologically, that isn't correct, right? We know that there are a lot of intersex people exist in the world, and that can be a whole range of different experiences of being intersex. So that could be someone who's born with a vulva and born with, grows breasts and all these things, but has a higher testosterone level than we would consider by our standards to be female. That would be an intersex experience. And we've just created these lines of like, this is what's normal, this is what's not. So I think when we look at these kinds of these modes of exclusion for transgender people, we have to think about how we've constructed these norms. They didn't just exist in nature. In nature, we see a full spectrum. So why are we trying to create these rigid labels and these rigid structures to fit people in that they don't naturally fit with it?
So I guess some people think it's an on-off, or a binary choice. You're either male or you're female, as you described. But what you're saying is there's a spectrum, and I guess that spectrum is what, of intersex and of sexual orientation. What based on your research, how would you describe it to me or someone who's trying to understand it?
Yeah, so I would say that when we're understanding identity, we've always created different labels to describe people. And we've created them with certain lines around them, right? Like, we've created them in certain boxes. Those boxes, we made them up, right? In order to understand experience. So when we think about gender is typically the way that we identify. We have associated certain physical traits, certain behaviors with certain genders. When we look at sex, that's typically associated with our anatomy. So gender and sex are two different things. Just typically when we think about sex, we think of a vulva or a penis, and we think of that as being a rigid binary. The reality is that both of those things are spectrums. Gender can have, and across different cultures, as we talked about with Two-Spirit, gender can have a lot of different labels, a lot of different experiences, but even sex can have different experiences. It's not just male and female. Biologically, we see a spectrum of experiences. So we see people who might have different physical anatomy, or people who might have different levels of estrogen or testosterone. It's a spectrum of experiences. So I think we really need to open our minds up to different experiences instead of trying to fit people into boxes that they don't naturally fit within.
There's been a certain percentage, I'm not sure what it is. Some people think it's 5 or 10 or 20% of the population that have been non-straight and have had these experiences, these realities from, I guess, history. If we were meant to be just male or female, and that was sort of evolutionarily what was the right thing, why would evolution continue to genetically produce non-straight people?
I'm not a geneticist, but I think we have an idea of history that doesn't always align with the facts, right? So we think of like, well, it's always been that men and women, they make babies. That's how sexual intercourse has always been. But when we look at queer theory, which is one of the areas that I work in, we can look at kind of the history of cultures and the different experiences of that people have had across cultures. For example, David Halpern, no relation, looks at ancient Greece. He uses Foucault's work to look at ancient Greece, and he looks at the ways that their sexual relationships were divided, and it was actually by power, right? So you had someone who was a citizen, a male citizen, and they were like the person in a higher power position, and they were the penetrative person of the person in a lower class position. So that might be a younger man who's not a citizen yet, that might be a woman, that might be a slave, that might be someone who's not a citizen at all. So that was actually the dynamic of choosing a sexual partner. Today we would consider that absurd, right? Like that's not how we divide within kind of our straight perceptions of the world. That's not how we divide sexual partners. So I think one of the things we need to do is really shift our understanding of sexuality, of gender, and really think about how it is historically, geographically, and culturally specific. It changes over time. It's not universal, and it's not inevitable. It hasn't always been the same way.
I agree with that. But I guess simplistically, and again, maybe naively, if we've always had and always continue to have non-straight people, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc., people, isn't it sort of then natural?
Yeah, of course. I think this diversity of experience is natural. A diversity of experience, I think, is what's normal and natural. I think that we can't kind of pigeonhole experience as any one thing and expect that that's the only way of being. There's always been diversity across cultures and history, and that's kind of what we need to embrace, that diversity, and open our minds to different experiences.
So then if it's natural and it's, whether it's evolution created it or God created it, and evolution is sort of survival of the fittest, and anything that doesn't work would be, weeded out over time, genetically, or if God created it, God never made any mistakes, then why do so many evangelical Christians and some people find real difficulty with non-straight people? I don't understand it. Because God can't make, if I'm an evangelical Christian, God can't make mistakes, and yet I guess he continues to do so.
I can't speak for evangelical Christians, but of course I agree with you. I think that, we have to kind of understand that every human being is different, and that our goal should be, regardless of what religious beliefs or cultural beliefs we come from, I really think we should be striving to understand each other, to listen to each other, and to be there for each other. I don't think we should be trying to change people or trying to create a world where everyone is the same. I think we should really be embracing difference and educating folks and increasing access and equity.
I got to ask you a couple of final questions, if we could, given your experience and your academic work, etc. In Texas and a couple of American states, I understand that they think that legally a sperm and an egg in a petri dish is a person.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a person?
No. It's such a silly thing. It's a bunch of cells, right? Like, I think that it's really dangerous across the board for anyone to think that an embryo is a person, whether that is for people who are infertile and go into a fertility clinic to get support, or for LGBTQ people who have done IVF. It's a really dangerous road to go down. It means that there's just so many implications, and it's very scary for doctors, because the doctors become criminalized for creating embryos to help people make babies. So I think a lot of when rulings kind of first started going out around seeing an embryo as life, a lot of fertility clinics had to shut their doors because they were afraid of being implicated legally, because there were the laws were just so outlandish, and really didn't make space for science. The science says these are not human beings; they're a bunch of cells, right? And like, yeah, that's how IVF works. We're putting cells together. We're making an embryo. It is not a human.
So, abortion has become a big issue in the United States election. Obviously, given the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it's really become an issue. And I think a lot of people have difficulty with the idea of a final trimester abortion. But legislating the ability for people to abort is something that, some people think that government should have that right, and other people think that government shouldn't have that right. And even if there's a lot of people that are pro-choice, I think they would have difficulty with a late trimester, third trimester abortion. Tell me where you come out on this issue.
Yeah, I think that every case is so incredibly unique. We really don't see like abortions happening in Canada right before a birth would typically happen. We do see people protecting a gestational parent's body. If there was a time when a parent or a carrier, a gestational carrier, was in danger, we certainly would put their body first. I think that we need to take it case by case. We trust our doctors, we trust our bodies, we trust our patients, and that they're the only voices that we can listen to. And I think that it is really a case by case issue to speak with individuals. I think that a lot of the time there's a lot of fear mongering around things that could happen or do happen that just don't happen.
So why has this become such a big issue in the United States? The way you describe it, it's a case by case sort of decision, and I would have thought that it is. I would feel personally very uncomfortable with a late trimester, a third trimester abortion, but the way you described it is if the mother's life was at risk, I guess I wouldn't. And so, how can people feel so fervently that they should have the right from a governmental standpoint to override the decision of the mother and the doctor?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a lot of reasons, and I think there's huge polarization in the US currently that is makes it so folks often don't hear different perspectives or are only hearing one stream of information, and that information might not be evidence-based. I think oftentimes it's rooted in religious ideology, in a very binary way of thinking. And I think it really does put people at risk. We've seen that in the United States. We've seen people die because they can't access care in the United States. And that could be care that they need to access because they've experienced a miscarriage. A lot of people want to have a baby and have to terminate their pregnancy for medical reasons, because of the fetus or because of themselves. Like, there's just so many reasons that this care is necessary, and we really need to allow doctors to do their work, allow people who are carrying pregnancies to make choices about their own bodies, and to trust that they're making the choices that are right in these situations. It is not the right of the government by any means to say what someone does with their body when it comes to reproductive rights.
You mentioned people with miscarriages not getting proper treatment. Is this really happening? Like, I've heard politically people talking about this in the US election, but is it really happening that doctors are turning females away that have miscarriage? We've heard these stories about people bleeding to death in cars outside of hospitals. This can't be true.
Oh, it's true. I mean, that is what's happening in the US. I think these laws are really, really scary. Doctors are really scared of being criminalized, of having these situations come up. And yeah, this is really happening. And it's a really a sad world that we're seeing. And there's a lot of unfortunate misinformation when it comes to reproductive rights, and when it comes to embryos, and when it comes to what people get to do with their bodies.
So let me, you're you study this on a regular basis, and you've written a book about some of these topics. My ex-wife had 2 miscarriages. And, we didn't treat it like it was a fingernail or, even an amputated limb or something like that. But it also wasn't a baby that we mourned at a funeral. We were sad, but we were more sad about a life that didn't happen rather than the ending of a life that had happened. And so, I'm really sort of in a quandary without, these different perceptions in the United States about how I feel about my own, the miscarriages of 2 babies that I could have had. But again, I could have had, I didn't have. How do you think I should feel about miscarriages?
I'm so sorry for your losses, and I can't tell you how to feel, but I do think that the questions that you're asking are really important. Oftentimes, when we grieve a loss, we grieve it differently, right? So, the book does talk about experiences of loss, and it allows it to be open to different experiences. For some people, a loss feels like, okay, I'm going to breathe through this and, try again next month. And for other people, they really want a ritual to say goodbye to the possibility and the future they imagined, right? So I think we have to tend to our own needs when it comes to loss. We have to think about what feels right for us. And that might be a ritual or some kind of memorial that you've created for yourself, or it might be kind of just reflecting and moving on. And everyone is going to be different. And that's going to change based on when that happens. That's going to change based on the care that's needed to support the miscarriage. And it's going to change based on the individual person. So I think, for some people who experience a very early miscarriage, that can be just as heartbreaking as someone who experiences a miscarriage a little bit later on, because you have this whole future imagined, and you have to grieve that experience of saying goodbye to what you thought might be.
But it's not the death of a human. Is that correct?
I mean, to each their own, but I think that's up to the person to decide as well.
Laine Halpern Zisman, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I think one that is helpful for us to have, just as we sort of understand people that are in our society and may not be exactly the same as us, and their own different experiences. And I congratulate you on writing your book, and just remind us the title and where we can get it.
Yeah, it is called Conceivable, a guide to making 2S LGBTQ plus family. And it's available online on the Fernwood website or any online book retailer.
Laine, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Toronto or from Victoria at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on YouTube, on podcast servers, as soon as my radio show goes to air. Thanks. You know what? We got to think about this more often. We got to meet people that are different than ourselves. We've got to be open to experiences that are different than ours. And I think Laine has helped us with that today. Thank you. Good night, everybody.